Okay, Dr. Williams, you can start.
All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the March is Criminal Justice Month, sponsored by the Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition. On behalf of our Executive Director, Ivanka Hall, and our Director of Research and Evaluation, Dr. Michelle Pugh, my name is Dr. Zachary Williams, and I'm the Public Policy Director. And today's discussion, we have a very interesting panel, a number of experts who will speak on issues connected to the Kerner Commission report from 1968, issue 24 in Cleveland, that will put the final decision on police policies and the discipline of officers in the hands of a civilian-led board and commission. And also we'll connect this to eventually a goal we hope to establish on the local level here and spearhead the effort toward developing anti-discrimination law and bill at the local level to promote anti-racism. But we want to welcome first, Dr. Alan Curtis, who's the Executive Director of the Eisenhower Foundation, and also connected with the Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders and the Kerner Commission. Will speak first and present on his work and the work of their foundation organization. And also we will talk about the connections between the Kerner Commission report and the unfinished business of today in terms of how issue 24 connects with that. And where do we go from here in terms of police reform? And how do we connect the community and police departments in order to help promote sustainable anti-racist policing that helps to promote communal growth and development. Next, we have Kareem Henton, who's from Black Lives Matter of Cleveland. And he'll specifically talk about, among other subjects, the issue 24. And then we have Jason Goodrick, who is on the Cleveland Community Policing Commission. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Curtis, who will speak first, then Mr. Hinton, and then also Mr. Goodrick after that. And then we'll have a dialogue with everyone, and then we'll have question and answer before we conclude. Thank you. Thank you all the panelists and everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, and thank you to the Coalition for this opportunity. My role today is to briefly advocate for police reform within a broader national and historical framework. As a baseline, I want to begin with the 1960s disturbances in Cleveland, Detroit, Newark, Washington, and over 150 other American cities. Whites tended to call the disturbances riots. People of color call them protests. For the most part, the same differences in framing hold true today. In response to the 60s protests, President Lyndon Johnson formed the bipartisan National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kerner Commission, named after the chairman of Otto Kerner, who was governor then of Illinois. Most of the members of the Kerner Commission were privileged white men who bore the imprimatur of the political establishment. Nonetheless, a majority of Kerner commissioners concluded in 1968 that the underlying cause of the protests was white racism, quote unquote, and that America was two societies, black and white, separate and unequal. The commission said that police had often sparked the protests and had overreacted after the protests began. The commission observed that for many people of color, the police had come to symbolize quote, the white power, white racism, and white suppression more than any other American institution. It is time the commission advised to make good the promises of America, democracy, to all citizens, urban and rural, black and white, Spanish surname, American Indian, and every minority group. Today, it is still time to make good the promises of American democracy to all citizens. But in healing our divided society, the Eisenhower Foundation's 50-year update of the Kerner Commission, we concluded that America has made relatively little progress in reducing racial injustice, economic inequality, and poverty, and in many ways, we have gone backwards. America has, of course, elected its first African-American president, and now we have an African-American and Asian American woman as vice president, a Native American woman as Secretary of the Interior, and a Latino man as Secretary of Education. There's been a dramatic increase in the number of African-American and Latino elected officials, and the African-American and Latino middle classes have dramatically expanded since the Kerner Commission. Yet neo-Nazis have made their statements and inflicted deaths in Charlottesville, and white supremacists have invaded the Capitol building in Washington. American public school segregation has increased since the Kerner Commission, beginning with the backward-looking federal policy of the 1980s. In spite of the Kerner Commission's criticism of police, for many decades, failed zero-tolerance policing has dominated police culture, as we know from Tamir Rice, from Michael Brown, from George Floyd, from Breonna Taylor, and so many other people of color. American sentencing laws remain racially biased. Almost 200,000 people were in jail or in prison at the time of the Kerner Commission in 1968. Today, because of the crime legislation of the 1980s and because of the crime legislation of the 1990s, the American prison industrial complex holds over 2.2 million, and they are disproportionately people of color. Yet in spite of mass incarceration and zero tolerance policing, the national murder rate today is comparable to the national murder rate in the 1960s. And America continues to have the highest rates of murder among all industrialized democracies. Income inequality and wealth inequality have dramatically increased since the Kerner Commission. The richest 1% of Americans hold about as much wealth as the bottom 90%. The deep poverty rate has increased since the Kerner Commission, in part because of what some have accurately called the welfare deform legislation of the 1990s. That legislation failed based, for example, on evaluations by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington. The richest country in history continues to produce the highest rates of overall child poverty among all industrialized democracies. The pandemic has made racial injustice, inequality, and poverty much worse. The resulting frustration among people of color and the resulting awareness among at least some white Americans then helped generate the mostly peaceful national protests in 2020 against police violence. These then have just a few of the leading trends since the Kerner Commission. If we hope to reverse such trends and heal our divided society, we need policy based on evidence and science, not on supposition and dogma. Yet today, relatively few American national, state, and local public sector programs are evidence-based. We need to change how evidence is valued in our nation, and we need to identify and seek to scale up what already has proven to work to reduce racial injustice, economic inequality, and poverty. Toward that end, the 68 Kerner Commission's recommendations began with economic and education priorities. We surely don't have time today, of course, to discuss the full range of economic and education policies that work, but they are illustrated by child tax credits, empowerment of labor unions, Keynesian demand-side investment in living wages, preschool for all children, equity in public school finance, and elimination of the school to prison pipeline. What does evidence-based policy mean in criminal justice today? Aware of the astronomical costs of racist prison building, states like California, New Jersey, and New York have reduced their prison populations by about 25% over recent years, and we need to accelerate such reductions across all states. And we need to encourage the movement to transform American prosecution into a system that ensures prosecutors make the fairest decisions, void of non-legal influences and biases. We need to change the status quo where prosecutors advance their careers by posturing on law and order. What police reform and place-based policies that work can be co-targeted to specific geographic locations with truly disadvantaged populations. In spite of the Breonna Taylor and George Floyd protests, there has been little police reform at the federal level. With the 2022 and 2024 elections coming, neither political party wants to criticize the police. And the ugly confirmation hearings for Judge Jackson last week demonstrated that the United States Senate is unlikely to pass meaningful criminal justice legislation anytime soon. At the local level, the Police Executive Research Forum in Washington has just issued a report urging police departments to create clearer guidelines on the use of force and to improve training and communication within their ranks. And I'm sure my colleagues today will talk about how that is being dealt with in Cleveland. So we must keep trying for federal police reform legislation. And we need to engage progressive police chiefs and progressive mayors to better utilize federal funds that are still available from pandemic legislation. There are, in fact, local evidence-based police reform models that the federal executive branch and local government can begin scaling up right now. For example, instead of what is conventionally called community policing, which often amounts to little more than public relations, our foundation, the Eisenhower Foundation, has demonstrated that genuine community police partnerships can work in very diverse locations, from San Francisco to South Carolina to New Hampshire to Puerto Rico. In our carefully evaluated demonstrations in these and other locations, community-based nonprofit organization staff and carefully selected police work as equals to mentor youth and to collaborate with residents throughout targeted neighborhoods. The evidence is that such partnerships hold promise for simultaneously reducing crime, reducing fear, diverting youth from the juvenile justice system, solving public security problems in democratic ways at the grassroots, increasing trust by residents in police in poor urban neighborhoods of color, sensitizing police to the people they serve, reducing violence by police, and reforming police culture. With increased resources and good training, local nonprofit and community organizations can complement police in many more ways. For example, by becoming community mental health responders, as in the CAHOOTS program in Eugene, Oregon, and by mediating disputes, as in the Cure Violence program in New York City. This is about community and police working more closely together in ways that both Black Lives Matter and progressive police chiefs can agree. As Black Lives Matter researchers have recently stressed, we need to define safety in a way that encompasses the full scope of our existence in our own communities. With good planning, genuine community police partnerships can be designed by creative mayors to help stabilize neighborhoods and so encourage community-based banking and small business development. It was pioneered years ago by the Model South Shore Bank in Chicago. In turn, community-based banking can help finance integrated housing by nonprofit entities like the Model Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation in Brooklyn and the Model New Community Corporation in Newark. The integrated housing can help facilitate integrated schools and generate good jobs for both community residents and formerly incarcerated people who are returning. For the formerly incarcerated, there are a number of excellent evidence-based models, like the Minnesota Comprehensive Reentry Plan. In other words, place-based, nonprofit-focused, and evidence-based policy at the grassroots needs to be holistic. Public safety, employment, education, and housing interventions need to be complementary and interdependent. They need not be separate and unequal. There is so much potential for de-siloed, place-based, multiple solutions to multiple urban problems. And reform of police culture can be a driving force for such multiple solutions. When I presented on these Kerner and healing perspectives at the annual meeting of NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, there was a great deal of support and energy. That is why we are now advocating for a White House conference on community, police, and youth, a convening led by organizations like Noble, Black Lives Matter, the Community Action Partnership, and the National Mentoring Partnership. People here today may not agree with such a White House conference, but I ask that we at least dialogue on it and related ideas, because we need to move beyond president in action at the national level. Yet new evidence-based policy, the kind I am advocating, cannot emerge without the new political will that the original Kerner Commission said was so necessary for progress back in 1968. What is the use of evidence in our threatened democracy if there is no will to take action? More than 50 years after the Kerner Commission, the creation of new will may be harder to achieve than ever. As he endorsed the Kerner Commission's recommendations in 1968, Dr. King was pursuing new will. He was advocating a multiracial coalition for economic justice among the poor, the working class, and the middle class. And then he was assassinated while protesting nonviolently with sanitation workers in Memphis. The creation of the King Economic Policy Coalition, which embraced and moved beyond the civil rights movement, needs to be one point of departure for the generation of new will in the 21st century. Side by side with Black Lives Matter, the way is being led by people like Bishop William Barber and his continuation of Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign against the immorality of poverty and inequality. History has shown that successful movements in America are inclusive and opportunistic. Successful movements build constituencies that cross-endorse one another in ways that mutually strengthen alliances. Some alliances were in fact strengthened in 2020, for example, through the predominantly peaceful protests against police violence. Today, to create new will, we need accelerated convergence among nonprofit organizations to complement and reinforce Reverend Barber and Black Lives Matter. Arguably, with elections approaching later this year and in 2024, the most important strategies for generating new will are support of voter rights and reversal of the widespread voter suppression that has been legislated in many states since 2020. Nationally, we need to abolish or modify the filibuster and to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. At the state level, we need a massive new public education campaign led by nonprofits and organized by labor to better inform citizens of voter suppression, to register voters, and to get them to the polls. If we don't significantly focus now on federal and local policies to get out the vote, Kerner and Healing and police reform could well be blocked for many years to come. Beyond voter rights, we need a much more creative dialogue on how to create new will. For example, other new will strategies might include devising school curricula for how to identify and combat misinformation, as being done now in some Scandinavian countries like Finland. Other new will strategies might include creating a new movement for evidence-based policy. Other new will strategies might include teaching honest history in schools. And other new will strategies might include mobilizing the performing arts and the visual arts to better facilitate Kerner priorities and voter rights, as Bishop Barber is doing with his moral fusion movement, and as artist Hank Willis Thomas is doing with his coalition of activist artists in all 50 states. I challenge my colleagues on this panel to propose their own new will strategies to all of us today. Keep in mind too that this is not just about domestic policy in America. Progress on creating new will and advancing Kerner priorities can increase American soft power as we face Russia and China. So that really is my message to you today. Several years ago, we debated some of these perspectives at the City Club of Cleveland. It was there on April 5th, 1968, the day after Dr. King was assassinated, that Senator Robert Kennedy spoke of, quote, the violence that affects the poor, that poisons relations between people because their skin has different colors. He lamented the slow destruction of a child by hunger, and schools without books and homes without heat in the winter. Reflecting on Dr. King, Senator Kennedy warned of indifference and inaction and slow decay. He spoke of the violence of institutions. As we now advocate for new will to reform these very institutions, including the police, I ask you finally again how long the dream has been deferred. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Perhaps that dream just sags like a heavy load. Or my colleagues, does it just explode? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Curtis. Brother Kareem Henton.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me, by the way. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And when we talk about, I have to contextualize this. And, when we talk about the Kerner Commission, we talk about, time in the 60s when there was a tremendous amount of unrest. I don't call them riots. I will never call them riots. They were, or those instances were people who were voicing their anger. This was the voice of the people who have been unheard. Here at Black Lives Matter Cleveland, we had a little slogan or a saying that we had actually put on a t-shirt. And the slogan was, government doesn't get woke until expletive gets broke. And so when you think about that, what we're saying is when things happen to property, which we know that that's what police have primarily been here for, is to keep Black people in line and also to protect the interest of white supremacy, and lastly, to protect property. And so when things started to break, then all of a sudden there was, well, hey, people started to pay attention. And so, it's a wonder, why, it just boggles the mind that you have those that will wonder, why are these people reacting this way? Well, let's just look back at what has happened in history. I think that it's a willful ignorance. It's a cognitive dissonance. It's people that just don't want to face the reality of the situation that we live in. And they actually are quite satisfied with their status as things are. And they're not necessarily interested in change. We saw in the 60s, brought on by President Johnson, the Kerner Commission. And the Kerner Commission very much so mirrored what we saw happen here in Ohio. Here in Ohio, after unrest was had here in Ohio, as well as around the country, our governor, Mike DeWine, decided that he was going to form a commission. And the commission was going to look at addressing racial disparities that are happening not just nationwide, but here within the state, so that they can determine what needs to be done. Nothing has really happened since then. But another interesting thing about that commission that Governor Mike DeWine decided to create was one that was not made up of the folks who were particularly or more so immersed and vested in the community. There was a reliance on the traditional organizations and people who have long been around. These were the organizations that have been around, and that these things that we see happening before us have been happening under their watch. And so it really doesn't make sense to bring them on, but that was done because of longstanding relationships or understandings at how these people, these organizations would easily be willing to compromise. So there was safety in going with the enemy that you know versus the one that you don't, versus the one that was taking it to the streets. The Kerner Commission stopped the way that I understood it after President Johnson heard that the Kerner Commission was going to be very highly critical of him and his presidency. And so therefore, the potential power that it could have had, it was wiped out. The report was pretty much made to be just a stack of papers, as opposed to being something that could have brought substantive change. I would dare say that Mike DeWine, maybe in the beginning here in Ohio, maybe had good intentions, but the fact that we live in a Trump era where he has brought out that it's okay to be an overt racist. It's okay to it's okay to not hide those things. And so the results are, you had a very vocal, I want to say vocal minority, but I think the way that I feel right now, I think I'd be lying. So you had a very vocal many. I'm not going to say they're the majority, but a very vocal many who were able to intimidate and influence Governor Mike DeWine into doing what he has done all the way up until this point in regards to bringing out or meting out some type of racial equity and justice, and that's nothing. One of the things that, if we are truly students of history, what we should be taking from this, and what many of us have already taken from this, is that we are to place very, very little solely in the hands of our elected officials to get done. They need the motivation to get it done, whether the motivation comes as threats to them continuing to hold elected office, whether it comes as stripping them of the power that they don't deserve to have, as we were able to do here in the city of Cleveland with issue 24. We have too many elected officials who don't wish to offend that agent, that partner that they have in law enforcement. And so as a result, what you have what one would consider, someone who is in power, but is neutered. They're afraid to utilize that power. I believe that many elected officials have had good intentions, but the problem is that once they get into office, their interests lie in not only getting reelected, but it's a matter of ego. They do not want to see power. And so that's what people have to do. When communities nationwide become fed up, motivated, and they become empowered, they too will craft the laws that they want to be governed by. They too will craft the policies that they feel needs to be put in place in order for them to live freer and more enriched lives. Again, that's what we did here in Cleveland. We must remember that there is no pure or truly selfless politician, none. The people must, in many instances, become the legislators as well as the voters. That means crafting what it is that you wish to help govern and enrich your lives. When being represented after the hard work has been done, when we craft this legislation, when we get this actually, when it's pushed over and it actually becomes a matter of law, a matter of charter. Again, I go back to the traditional folks and the traditional organizations. It's imperative that in your blueprint to achieve these things, that you not continuously look to the individuals and the same individuals and the same agencies that these things happen while on their watch. They are not the true agents for change, nor have they been for either ever or for quite some time. And so in the blueprint, you have to, there's a saying that, you leave the dance with who got you there. And so I say that to the folks here in Cleveland, the folks around the country that, and across the state, that you have intellectual people, analytical people, you have bright people who are connected and well-centered. They are vested in their communities, and they are not once, twice, and three times removed from the situations that many of us, that our communities suffer. They're not living in the suburbs. They are not folks who, their children aren't necessarily children who are going to private schools. So they have a vested interest in seeing it through and making it right. These intellectual people are part of this grand movement that you're seeing, not only in this city, not only in this state, but across this country. And so we must trust in those individuals, not these traditional organizations, to see this thing through. They're not bound by past relationships, favors being done, and so forth, that may make them perhaps compromise the good work that had been started by folks who have been the boots on the ground. And it is their being directly affected that keeps them fighting for the community rather than jockeying for an opportunity of enrichment, jockeying for a job, or even if they weren't jockeying for it, to just be willing to, there's not a better word other that I can find to use other than sell out, but to sell out the people that they supposedly represent by getting a job. If they weren't jockeying for it, it will be offered, and then you will have folks that will take that if their interest is more so in self rather than the community. We were able to, I'm honored to say that I was able to be a part of contributing policy when the consent decree unfolded, or rather the mandates of the consent decree came down here in Cleveland. From the very beginning, I was able to come in contact with and meet and be friends with people like the illustrious Brenda Bickerstaff, people like Alicia Kurtman, Samaria Rice, and others. But also through my advocacy, I also knew these people, but I developed a better and I guess far more important relationship because it became a relationship of trust. And these are the people that, you know, among others, that are, you know, a big part of why we were successful in getting issue 24, which represents and is community oversight over the police. Because here in Cleveland, as we learned from history, we saw from previous government mandates that came in where the DOJ said, hey, you guys have to get your act together. And the police said, we got this, we'll take care of it. And what actually happened once the government took their eyes away, the city stopped working towards any substantive change, and they went back to doing the things they've always have done. They have a long history of that, as I'm sure the next speaker will speak on as well. But because we learned from this history, we knew that it was imperative that we must come up with the policy, the laws that we know would actually make oversight of the police who have been getting away literally with murder, that perhaps we can bring that to an end, that we could actually change the culture in policing. I mean, for those who are abolitionists, you know, I say to you that those who work towards police reform are not necessarily dealing abolition of betrayal, but rather many of us, myself included, have a more pragmatic approach where we believe that incremental change towards abolition, towards the change of policing in a way that policing won't be recognized as policing any longer, is the way to go. Solely because where we are, we know that people are not ready for, government is not ready for, society is not ready for just rapid change. And the laws are not geared for that. And so therefore, we have to individually take the laws, play by their rules, or play and beat them by their rules and by their own game, and actually create the change that we want to have. And over time, we will have that, that imagined outcome that we've had that has really started all of us and motivated all of us in this work. So what I'd like to say, you know, in closing, with regards to what we were able to achieve here in Cleveland regarding issue 24, which is now Charter Amendment 115, is that these things don't happen because politicians want it to happen. These things happen because the people want it to happen. And when the people truly want it to happen, they put in the work and they make it happen. And so, you know, I implore everyone who wants to change, wants to create change, that they look at the roadmap that has been laid out here in Cleveland, and that they follow suit along with the brilliant, brilliant people like Samaria Rice, Brenda Bickerstaff, Alicia Kirkman, who've done such fine work, because you have to keep this in mind. These people didn't just sit around, they lost their loved ones. Their loved ones were murdered, stripped, taken away from them. And they didn't just sit back and cry. They didn't just sit back and lament and just say, I have been defeated. What these people actually did was they said, I am going to make that death mean something. They're going to regret the day that they did this to me and my family. And so I salute, you know, these family members, these ladies, these beautiful women that I've gotten to know and that have become my family. And I just implore everyone to, you know, look to these people, include them, include the people. Don't let it just be academics, and don't count on politicians. Do it yourself and make that change. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Hinton. Mr. Goodrick.
Hello, everybody, and thank you to the coalition for having me today. It's an honor to be here with you and to follow such great panelists here. So my name is Jason Goodrick. I'm currently the executive director of the Cleveland Community Police Commission. That is an organization that was created by the consent decree, which is an agreement between the Department of Justice and the city of Cleveland to reform the Division of Police, which they entered into in 2015. That agreement mandated a body of citizens mixed with a few representatives of police organizations who will go out and be a listening post for the community's wants and needs as far as police reform. Now, that organization was not given a lot of teeth, right? And so it was a negotiated agreement, and it was definitely a sign of that incrementalism that Kareem mentioned, where they had a choice to make, and they chose to just make us an advisory board, which is what we currently sit now. But we are on the cusp of change now that issue 24 is moving forward. So when we look back, I'll just personally say, the Kerner Commission was a life changer for me. I was working in East Cleveland in my 20s, without disclosing how old I am. That was quite some time ago now, and I was a firefighter there in East Cleveland, Ohio, which is one of the oldest inner ring suburbs of Cleveland, with nearly 100% population of descendants of slaves and persons who are identified as Black and brown. With all the ills described in those reports we see in the 1960s, still, when I was working there in the 2000s, high poverty, educational problems, crime problems, you name it. And it would have been clearly in the 60s labeled a ghetto in any of these reports. And when I read it, I was kind of, it was amazing to me being exposed to that, because as we talk about a lot today, I never got that in school as a privileged white male going to, what would be considered a decent school systems in suburbs growing up. No one ever told me about the Kerner Commission. We didn't get that history of the descendants of slaves and the experience of Africans who were brought here against their will and integrated in this country through the white power structure. And so it was really prophetic to read that and say, when Kerner Commission said in 1967, we're heading towards two societies in America, I was in one when I was first exposed to it. So it was kind of eye-opening. It led me to the journey where that was kind of the first thing, if I had to pinpoint something that led me to where I am today, it was probably that document, and being exposed to it, and then seeing around me the results of not listening. And I think, I'm going to say that now, and I'll say it again. I think part of the problem of why we are where we are and why the commission was created was because of not listening. There are still politicians who argue that issue 24 wasn't necessary, that they had everything under control. And I beg to differ, having sat in the seat since the consent decree was signed. I think issue 24 was a direct result of not listening, which is a direct result of not listening, which is a direct result of not listening, going all the way back for many, many decades, even far beyond our history, all the way back to our Declaration of Independence, when there were people who were probably sat there, who would have been on a panel, who were fighting for equity and equality and freedom for Africans at that time. So, it's a situation that we get back to, and it always comes down to not listening. And I think that's why issue 24 was created. So, we talk about the 60s, and they're really, it's really, I'll go into them in more detail, how particular those were in Cleveland for police and policing, and how we missed a great opportunity in the 60s to do it differently. Because MLK, right before he was killed, he mentioned the promised land. He said that we the people, the same way that they declared in the Constitution, we the people, all the people, we'll get to the promised land together if we have what Dr. Curtis mentioned, the will. And also the other component is hope to get there. But clearly we're not there, and we're approaching 250 years of broken promises. How many leaders, Lincoln, Kennedy, King, Obama have called on Americans to soul search, right? Whenever we're at a crossroads, whenever a report comes out like the Kerner Commission, they say it's time for some soul searching. It's time to take action, right? It's time for us to really decide who we are as a nation. And at each point, we failed, and we failed dramatically in doing what the right and rational thing was, because emotions like hate, anger, white people fear, kept us from taking that path that we should have, to go down the road that would have taken us to a whole different place, the promised land that King dreamed of, the place where Frederick Douglass described, where citizens were all equal in the United States. So it's really a much longer journey than what we're discussing here, as many of you are already aware. But that's really, I've really taken that to heart more so than I ever have in this position here, how important it is that now is really the time, because so many people have said now is the time before, and it wasn't the time. So, that whole history going through all the different civil rights acts, all the things that we've done in 250 years, and that brings us to now, right? And the focus of this conversation is police as the agents of government, right? And it's undeniable at this point, the body of evidence is overwhelming, that police have been complicit in resisting that all men created equal doctrine that so many people have spoke about. They've been complicit in the promised land, in preventing that from occurring. I don't think that's disputable at this point. And it's not an indictment of all police officers, right? We got to get away from that political rhetoric. That's one of the things that prevent us from moving forward. It's not all police. There's no doubt that you could find people who will give testimony that an officer helped their family or saved their life at some point, but it's just not enough. It's just not enough, because on the flip side, there's also many people who have come forward and told their painful stories, and people like Kareem had mentioned, who have lost loved ones to the opposite of that, right? To the bad policing, to the police officers who were overtly racist in some instances, the police officers who were criminals, the police officers that were psychopaths. They exist, and so we have to get past that it's either one or the other, because it's complex, and there are both of those. And I've definitely seen that since I've been in this position since 2015. So in the Cleveland area, Cleveland in the 1800s had a small and thriving Black community, and it wouldn't last. It was bound for great things here. But after Reconstruction and the Civil War, we had the Great Migration as Cleveland's descendants of slave population and free persons from the South increased that were Black and brown individuals. We didn't have specifically the Jim Crow laws that some other places had, but certainly the police department was very white, very powerful, and they were determined to, even though Jim Crow laws didn't exist here in Cleveland, enforce them like they did. Let's quite frankly say that. That again, it's undisputable, it's well documented. So in the CPC here, one of the projects that I'll talk about today is our 100 Years of Policing project, right? And this started as an internet argument, to be honest with you. There was an officer who was debating me on a Facebook post about how in the 1970s, he was a Cleveland police officer, and that was when they did everything from a higher moral standard, and they were great heroes and great professionals at that time. So that's when I went into a can of worms that just led to one document after another that disputed that fact. Thousands and thousands of pages of recommendations and studies and commissions and reports detailing the history of the Cleveland Division of Police, going all the way back to 1922, when the first organizational study was done with the Cleveland Foundation with Felix Frankfurter, who was later a Supreme Court justice, recommending massive overhaul to the Cleveland Division of Police at that point in time because of their Byzantine operation, their injustices, their violation of civil rights to people, and their unconstitutional practices. So here in Cleveland, that's when it first started for us. And again, that was in the 20s. And moving forward to the 60s and 70s, we see an explosion of that in our research, of recommendation after recommendation, the Kerner Commission just being one of them. Probably close to, we found well over a dozen, about 15, and some of those fed into the Kerner Commission like this, which is called Cleveland's Still Unfinished Business, which was referred to as the Mini Hoover Commission, right? The Mini Hoover Commission was a civil rights and looking at the uprisings in the neighborhoods and fed into Kerner at the time, but it was a local effort. And it wasn't just white privileged people that were doing this. A lot of these recommendations had some of what would be considered the Black Power establishment at the time in Cleveland, which was also growing in politics here in the 60s and 70s, including Louis Stokes, who was on that, who was Representative Stokes, making recommendations that were, again, not listened to. And some of those things were groundbreaking in the 60s and 70s, and it's not just the Kerner Commission report. So we had in the 60s, we had the Little Hoover Commission. We had the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice, which they put out a report called The Challenge of Crime in a Free Society. We had, going into the 70s, we have all kinds of localized memos and reports. We have the American Bar Association making standards of police performance in urban police departments. We have a national strategy to reduce crime put out by another presidential commission in 73, the National Advisory Commission on Criminal Justice Standards and Goals. We have the report of police by the National Advisory Commission, again, 600 pages of recommendations for how to alleviate, which if they would have put in place, we wouldn't be in a consent decree today. And on and on and on the list goes. Some of the recommendations that you see in there are for bringing in more diversity into the police department, okay? Advocating for a police commission in the 60s to exist like we just voted in issue 24. There's asking the police to stop sensationalizing crime. Dr. Curtis mentioned we are equivalent to some of the murder rate numbers we had in the 1960s. But what our research found is time and again, there was no correlation in any of these documents looking back to 1922 that police had really any impact on crime. So what measure of performance do we do with the police department, right? Is it about crime and fighting crime? Because if it is, they're a failure in that regard when you look over 100 years, because the crime goes up and down, but it's really the fear of crime that drives a lot of this and trumps some of the better recommendations, because crime is used as sensationalism. And that's one of the things in the 60s that they asked the police to stop doing. Come out with evidence, have rational conversations about crime, involve the community in conversations about crime and policing, so that you just don't go off of that fear-based response and allow police to have so much power. They talked about limiting police discretion and community needing to do that by local legislation all the way back in the 60s and 70s. We saw the American Bar Association in the 60s call upon governments to stop, warning them of the increasing power of police unions and limiting to police union negotiations to strictly being inclusive of what labor law does. Now, we see community members who are fed up and frustrated at how much power our local police unions have at the table. And that's because over time it was given to them incrementally, and they've gone far beyond what bargaining law says and labor law says should be the core of their negotiations. And they're now allowed to participate in conversations about policy and management rights where they did not have those things before. We see calls for transparency in the 60s. And one of the most surprising ones to me, we even saw calls to, in the police academies, take a more academic university approach, which includes teaching the history of African-American experience all the way back in the 60s. They were calling for police academies to teach now what we would call critical race theory. So, as much as I'd like to say that the consent decree is filled with new and wonderful ideas, it's not. It's the federal justice coming in and Department of Justice coming in and saying, we now have power that we may not have had in the 60s, but we're going to demand reforms that have been called for 50 plus years here in Cleveland, and that smart people from all different backgrounds had come and made recommendations to politicians, and they had just not acted on it, or they had acted on it from a reactionary standpoint, taken the low-hanging fruit off the vine, and then said, we've successfully achieved police reform, but that reform has never proven to hold. And that's evidence in the 2014 DOJ investigation when they came back and said, all of these same problems have been recurring for the last 100 years, are still there. So now it's time to mandate them through court change. And here's the double-edged sword of that. And that's why I'm so happy to see that Clevelanders took upon themselves to institutionalize a way here through issue 24 to always have a say in policy going forward, because the communities that haven't done that in other cities where they've had consent decrees have, when we look at those cities now, we look at places like Cincinnati and Pittsburgh, there's a tremendous amount of writing and academic study and great journalism that shows that those places who have ended their consent decrees have backslid. So we need to consider that the floor and not the ceiling, the consent decree. It's a starting point. It's a starting point for people to empower themselves to make sure that all of these good recommendations actually become a reality here in Cleveland. Because what we don't need is more recommendations. You know, I think we have enough of them. And as I read them more and more and more over the past 100 years, all we need to do is go back now that we have a body that can do this and say, let's pull the best of these and make them a reality. You know, the time to form new commissions and new think tanks, while there's still some value to saying, okay, how do we put a modern day twist on some of these things, right? And how do we navigate the modern era for this recommendation? That's about as far as the conversation can go, because I promise you, if you look at our project, 100 Years of Police Reform in Cleveland, we have a great online database now filled with all of these recommendations we could pull from these reports, and we keep finding more and more reports, more and more things that people have provided to us. So I'm happy that this commission will now become a body that can say, you know what, we don't have to just send this to the politicians anymore. We can just say, we want this to be, okay? We want this to be, and that's what it will become. And sure, there are some challenges to that, right? It's always easier if you can get some buy-in for it, right? I hope that this new commission that is empowered with subpoenas and able to overrule discipline decisions and all of these things, I hope they will rarely have to exercise that power. Because what I hope is that people have now seen that the people who live here, the people who have felt the effects of these reforms not being put into place for far too long, I hope now on the flip side of that conversation, the people who would traditionally oppose it will sit down at the table with the new commissioners and say, yeah, okay, let's just talk about how we make these a reality here and what we do. And then it is a matter of evidence. You know, we can no longer trust that just because we change a policy, that it's going to take effect. We have to have good data collection. We have to have good monitoring. We have to be able to amplify our ability to test that. We have to go out and get experiential stories and no longer suppress those voices. And we have to stop the police PR machine. No longer should they be on the pulpit contradicting people's stories and opinions about what happened to them. You know, that is one thing that has been called upon too, is the way public relations is handled by police is very self-serving. It's not in the interest of the community members. How is it in the interest of the electorate who the police serve, or the community members that the police serve, when the police stand up and say, your experience didn't really happen and we don't agree with that? You know, and that's been something that I've heard for far too long here, even in the modern times, but they've mastered it very well. You know, so I think now with this commission, we are truly at the crossroads that many people have said before us. And this time I think we're leading to real change because the power has shifted. You know, our research shows that the police have held the power. And the reason why is because they're the only continuity here. The police department does have organizational learning, but their learning is through self-preservation a lot of times. So they're teaching generations of police officers how to resist change, how to resist politicians, how to uphold tradition, right? Here we have administrations come and go. And when they try to break into that and change that, it often isn't fruitful. And I think, you know, I'll finish with Carl Stokes, who said, you know, one of his greatest regrets when he was the first African-American mayor here was his inability to change the Cleveland Division of Police. And his quote, I believe, was that the Cleveland Police is still just as Byzantine an organization as it's ever been, and traditional in its practices and flat out really resistant to change. And his lesson was, at his point, he thought no mayor would ever be able to reform the Cleveland Division of Police successfully. And I think that's held true for all these years. But now the people have taken it upon themselves to do that through the commission. And although the commission is changing, I was really grateful to be a part of the beginning of that, you know, welcoming all of these voices like Kareem's and all of the people and listening to their stories and hearing these experiences. And Ivanka, even going back to your very first pre the commission meeting where you had the community conversations, and you delivered your long list of, and that was a wonderful event, where people came, and I think you might have been one of the first people to capture stories and recommendations and forward them in this process. And that's just been wonderful to be a part of it. And I'm happy to answer any questions about this. But again, I would encourage everybody who thinks that they have some great, wonderful idea to go and look at our research and see how many times people like us have tried and tried and tried with some iteration of those same ideas over the last 100 years and been met with resistance and failure. And we got to look for a different model here. And I think Cleveland can be the model now that issue 24 exists, thanks to the hard work of Kareem and Brenda Bickerstaff and Alicia and Samaria Rice and all of the activist groups. There's too many to name who coalesce with them to do a movement. And it's something to be said when 60% of the electorate in this day and age, so it was a little more than that, I think, even that said overwhelmingly yes. Yes, we want this. Yes, we want something different. Yes, we're ready. And it's awesome. So I'll close with that.
You're on mute, Dr. Williams.
A few quick questions in the time that we have remaining. One, what makes this moment different? You mentioned, Jason, that there are tons of recommendations and information. So there is no lack of, of data information, and that's what policymakers privilege, but more importantly, people's experiences and the passion in the moment is also meeting with the information. So I'm curious to know what as an advisory board, and also what are the forms you can take going forward. What do you foresee will make this moment different to where you can go from just an opportunity to actually making the changes take place and making them stick? One. To Brother Henton, Ivanka has talked about oftentimes that the fulfillment of the Kerner Commission report is in issue 24. How do we connect one to the other to make Cleveland a site where other cities can model? And it even goes beyond the whole circular debates around defund the police or not. So how can issue 24 actually live up to actually being, a sort of people's movement around police transformation, reform, whatever the language? Then Dr. Curtis, you mentioned something interesting about calling on the White House to convene a conference. Reading earlier, I found that in an earlier report, might have been the Smithsonian, that the conference convened under the Obama-Biden administration was more top-heavy, top-down, focused on police reform. And you mentioned a number of other groups and organizations, among them Black Lives Matter, and other groups that you would suggest would be invited to this one. How would you propose this conference to be structured that would have a different outcome than the other one? And how do we bring all these together to actually create transformation? So however you'd like to approach those questions. Jason, Brother Hinton, and then Dr.
All right, I'll go with mine, and I know I don't want to eat into too much time here, but I think one of the major differences is information, right? In the past, the police, the politicians, they held all the cards and they spoon-fed the information. I think I'd like to hear, Dr. Curtis's opinion on this too, how different things have changed, right? So now I have seen it with my own eyes where a politician or a police chief will put out a bit of information and someone will call them on their BS right there. I mean, right there, and say, no, that's just not true. Your information is contradictory, because people are now in the era of where social media, they can see the stories, it's no longer oppression. Someone can share on social media their complaint they filed against the police, so no longer can the police deny that complaint exists or hide that complaint or bury that complaint. So I think that's the game changer, is information has shifted the power structure and people are now better informed. And I think that's one of the CPC's core roles going forward, is to make sure, that that battle of misinformation that Dr. Curtis mentioned is important in all arenas, right? The CPC can't get involved in that rhetoric. They can't be the people who throw out misinformation, right? They have to be the guardians of looking for facts, truth, and evidence, and then giving that to the people. And that way we hold that power, because we then know what the real data, what it is. The transparency is just different. And I think that's the game changer. And I think that was a big part of issue 24 and why it wasn't able to be countered, because the facts and the data was now out, and it just where it fell is where it fell, and it fell on the side of change. It couldn't be contested. So,
with regards to the question that you asked, the difference here, how folks can, perhaps duplicate what was done here, the game changer is just people power, and it's people power utilizing the very rules and systems at play that have helped to disenfranchise us. So how many times have we heard, I'm just going by policy, I'm just enforcing the law? Well, we helped to create law. We helped to create policy. And so now that in and of itself is the game changer. That was done in mind, in mind, the collective bargaining agreements that oftentimes are used to circumvent oversight, to circumvent any kind of accountability. And because, we got a lot of practice in this. We've been dealing with this for a very long time. Einstein's definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So with that in mind, we knew that things had to be different. Anybody seeking to duplicate what has been done here, you're going to need the advice of attorneys. But you're also going to need, but you can't just totally rely upon them, can't just totally rely upon academics. You have to have the people that are affected by this so that they can explain how the things that the academics, the attorneys, and so forth, perhaps are contemplating to put in place that, hey, that's not going to work unless you do this, or if you do that, this is how it's going to affect me, because we have the benefit of lived experience. We know how these things are going to affect us. And so we have to have a seat at the table when it comes to crafting and creating this policy. But after you craft and create this policy, it then becomes a ballot initiative. And once it becomes that, once you get those signatures, you're able to get it on the ballot, the people have spoken, and, you basically, have to then just continue what got you here in the first place. And that's people power. People have to show up. They have to, they can't just say, okay, we got it done, and then step away from it. We're going to let them handle it. Because no, you can't just let them handle it. You have to keep in mind that one of the best ways you can kill something that is perhaps a worthwhile program, a worthwhile agency that's being created as a result of what you passed, they kill it by not funding it. And so you have to craft it in a way to make sure that it's not going to get that it's not going to get underfunded or defunded. You have to do that. So like I said, with attorneys helping you craft that legislation, getting it on the ballot, getting it, doing a very good informational campaign, actually engaging the community, not just imposing something on the community saying that I know what you need better than you do, but rather this is what we need, but also what's your input, making them feel and know that they are involved. You're going to get that community participation. And so once that thing is passed, you just have to keep your eye on it so that they know that you're watching. Because one thing that these politicians will then recognize is that this people power did that. This people power could also get me unelected. They're less likely to oppose it. And we just saw that here with the mayor's proposed budget, where overwhelmingly city council approved the budget, which included so much in it that to make sure or to ensure that issue 24 becomes a reality. It's well funded. You only had 2 politicians, 2 city council members that went against it. They were placating to basically their voter base, those that they know vote, that are just purely unconditionally pro-police. They placated to them, and they were the ones that did not vote in favor of it. And that was the sole reason why, that not wanting to cede away any power. But because that watchful eye is there, those folks who are not necessarily elected by the unconditional police supporters, those are the ones that approved it, because in all honesty, they knew they better had. Thanks.
In terms of a White House conference, it may or may not be possible, depending on what rules for the conference would be negotiated. What is needed, I believe, is a convening among people who are thinking and advocating the way we have been today. The long run solution is not top down. The long run solution is bubble up and is people power. We need community organizers and youth advocates and police reform advocates to get together and decide how, especially in the mold of Bishop Barber, we could proceed in a unified way nationally by self-reinforcing one another and by identifying models that are working or have the potential to work in a bubble up way to really reform the police, as you are progressing in Cleveland. And so as we identify those models, we can then move to saying how we can spread those models, how we can replicate them nationally. So I've been so impressed by the thinking and the advocacy here today. I just want to conclude by wishing you Godspeed in your work in Cleveland.
Thank you all. I turn it over to Ivanka, our Executive Director.
I want to thank you all. I want to thank you all for your time, your energy, and your efforts to not only look at, but to change our policing, not only in Cleveland, but across the country. This is a very important issue to us, and that is why we could not let Criminal Justice Month pass by without talking about why it's important for all of us to be here. When I set out to host the community conversation on the Department of Justice, I never expected that it would cost me my career. I never expected that I would walk into a job and be told that I was fired for speaking out about the conditions that were going on in the community. But I did understand the power of the pen, and I did understand that our document, the Community Corrective Action Plan, was a document that set a lot of things in motion for us here in Cleveland. Um, I am an ally, I'm an advocate, and I'm an activist. And for my organization to work with you all that are doing great work, it is important to us to make sure that the voice of the community is always heard, that we cannot get anywhere unless we are willing to help take them to where they need to go. And so, for our communities that are having such a hard time, for our young people in particular, trying to make sure that they understand the role of policing, and what role they can play to help change their lives, and the future of their families is important to us. I think that at no other time did we realize just how important our power is. I want to thank you, Kareem, Black Lives Matter, for all the moms who advocated for issue 24. That is something that is a game changer for our community. For the Cleveland Community Policing Commission, I will always press you to do what I think is right and fair, and y'all know how I roll. And for Dr. Curtis and the Kerner Commission report, for me, I have always used that Kerner Commission report to hold it up as a model of this is what we need to do if we are willing to take action. We can no longer write reports and allow them to sit on shelves. We have to make sure that there are some action behind those words. People don't take the time out of their lives to ask for change, and change never comes. People want change, and that is important to them, and that is important to the Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition. So myself, my team, Dr. Williams and Dr. Pugh, want to thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate your time, efforts, and energy, and we will fight with you. Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Ivanka.
Thank you.